My name is Sinthujan Varatharajah. I'm based in Berlin. I'm a writer and researcher, and mostly like focus on issues of statelessness, immobilities, mobilities, as well as displacement in my writing.
And my name is Hebh Jamal, and I'm a Palestinian journalist. I'm originally from New York. Well, originally, I am originally from Palestine, the village of Jimsu that was ethnically cleansed in 48. But I grew up in New York City and moved to Germany, Mannheim, Germany, in 2020. So been here for a few years. Um, so thank you again, Cynthia John. I know I keep saying this, but really, truly, thank you again. And I want to start off this conversation by telling you and also the audience, after you very much kindly sent me your book and I read it, the very first time I was witnessing in and also witnessing your conversations around concepts of solidarity, I always felt sort of provoked. I always felt sort of, I felt like I just couldn't understand, at the time I considered it, oh, like oppression Olympics, right? Like why is this just always a competition? So and then I was frustrated also because I initially sort of I look at this so-called international solidarity with the Palestine movement. And something that I've had a lot of trouble with is, okay, all of this solidarity exists, right? But it doesn't produce any material changes. Like the Palestinians are still dying in the tens of thousands. So I'm just wondering, like, how do you kind of reconcile with that? I guess with my initial reaction, it has
Mhm.
changed, and I want to talk about how this has changed for me. But yeah, I just sort of want to hear your initial thoughts about that.
Thank you. I think it's a very common reaction that people feel provoked as well as maybe outraged as well, and will very quickly frame any type of critique towards the dynamics of solidarity internationally as a form of oppression, Olympics, or competition that is being drawn or kind of like pointed to. But generally, I feel like there is a bit of a romanticization of solidarity that is very kind of current, as well as very widespread, I think, amongst many people that I feel quite yeah, uncomfortable with, specifically also speaking like from the point of view and the kind of community that I come from. So just as a context, I'm Elam Tamil, which means like my parents also like arrived as refugees. I was born in a refugee camp and we've lived here for the last 40 years and are still struggling and fighting for our independence as well as justice and accountability in regards to the so-called Sri Lankan state. And having kind of experienced and grown up in this community, and having seen also the ways of how we've been rendered quite like invisible and kind of like pushed into this side conversation or into a drawer that is of the forgotten people, it always felt a little bit like cynical and also maybe frustrating and aggravating, I think, personally, but I think also collectively for a lot of like Ila Tamil people to watch how much disregard there has been in regards to our own issue, and then how much potential there was also in regards to how people were able to mobilize for other issues. And to me, I think these conversations often are domesticated, right? So they're kind of like held in private, and people kind of vent out their anger in private, but very few people actually take it to a more public kind of realm because of fears of precisely those kinds of reactions and accusations. And I think as a way of collectivizing and as a way of kind of like challenging as well as encouraging and kind of a discursive kind of engagement, I think it is critical and important for us really to take these conversations into the public, even though they are uncomfortable. But I think their discomfort is a productive space to start from.
Mm. I mean, I could tell you about like my initial sort of the reason why I felt this was so important was because I have been confronted with the concept of, where do I stand on multiple times. So I've been I have been confronted, when I was in college the very first time by a Sudanese brother who, was frustrated why I never spoke about Sudan, or why I never spoke up for Sudan, or beyond the Facebook comments or initial tweets or whatever. And I was frustrated at him because I didn't understand why he expected me to, be a poster person for all of these different groups. And but this goes into another question for me, which
Mhm.
is like, whose responsibility is it to sort of understand a struggle or a movement or a liberation movement, and then how does that translate into a responsibility to act? And but like let's say if I did speak up, right? Let's say I wanted to speak about Sudan in a productive way or in a way that takes center stage for me, like for Palestine. Doesn't that can that can't that also be sort of speaking over people who are Sudanese, people who have the legitimacy in these conversations? So I yeah, how do you reconcile with like pursuing knowledge and like and trying to understand these different conflicts, different
Mhm.
liberation struggles?
I mean, we live in a time, right, where social media is like prone to be like one of the primary ways of how we express ourselves as well as how we perform ourselves as well, right? And also like how expressions of solidarity are oftentimes communicated, which means that a lot of times people kind of interrogate as well as monitor our online activities, as well as the focus, as well as the maybe blind spots that we implicitly produce, right? And I think specifically if you come from directly from a struggle, right? And I think it's a very specific positionality. If you come from a struggle and from a specific kind of history of violence, I feel like there is a very different or a different kind of subjectivity as well that you're faced with, which renders you or pushes you in a specific position where I feel that's a different interrogation than to say like an ally, someone who's non-concerned but who's kind of interested and also active in mobilizing as well as counteracting violence towards a certain group, right? And I think for you as a Palestinian, for instance, I think I find it difficult to directly kind of like critique you in your own kind of focus on your own history, as well as their own people's kind of struggle for self-determination, independence, end of apartheid, end of occupation, and so on and so forth. But I do think amongst all of us, right? Like we've met here as a Palestinian as well as an Elam Tamil. So we're both directly from histories of colonization and oppression. I feel like there is a need for us to kind of converse and to kind of get in direct interaction as well as conversation to also like measure out the amount of solidarity and the type of solidarity we need. So I feel like when people ask us of something, like I think it's okay to ask back, like, what do you need from me? Because if solidarity is a practice, and I feel like because we produce these flat out responses and we think that solidarity is a practice that needs to be equal to every single thing. But every single issue requires specific type of actions and specific type of kind of like responses. And these responses need to be on pair as well as in conversation with those most concerned, right? So if concerned people ask us to amplify their voices, that's a very straightforward kind of ask, right? And that means that we don't necessarily need to put our own analysis on top of their posts. We can just share them and amplify them and kind of give them the platform and counteract measures of censorship and other things, right? But then if people, for instance, invite you to a demonstration and then ask you to kind of like take a role on a stage, and make a speech or something, then I think, of course, there needs to be a negotiation even within yourself and also the kind of representative role that you take, right? And how much you want to speak. And I think the act of overwriting mostly happens when we employ our own analysis, when outsiders employ their own analysis of a situation, and then also sometimes distort and override concerned people's own critical sense of reflection and way of mirroring their own realities.
I, okay, I completely understand you, but here's the thing that I'm also I have a lot of struggle with these concepts because on one hand, I try to always connect the Palestinian struggle with other struggles.
Mm,
I try to, for example, with the occupation of Kashmir, I try to look at the similarities between India and Israel, look at the connections and all of this stuff. But my question is that actually reductive to
mm,
constantly view other liberation struggles and other, other like histories of people and only in how it relates to yourself?
mm,
And like because for example, I mean I know that there's a lot of similarities between us two, right? But I have never actually been in encounter with another Elon Tamil pe person besides you, right? Like I
mm,
have actually I didn't, so I never knew about the genocide until I came in contact with you and other activists. And so my question is I feel like this is just a trap. Like I feel like
mm,
I feel like once we start to only view it as like mirroring of our own selves, um,
mm.
I could never actually truly understand other people, other struggles, and fight for them in a way that just is powerful.
I totally agree. I think it's a very intuitive kind of like bodily reaction that we try to understand others through our own bodies, which means that we try to kind of create bridges. But of course, there's limits to it, right? Because it also disallows you from seeing the differences and the specificities, right? And it creates a kind of reductive, I think, frame because it constantly kind of also reinforces yourself in that story, right? Whereas we should actually like reach a point where we take a distance and are able to speak about something that has nothing to do with us, but is just in kind of in contradiction with our values, right? And I feel like a lot of times, in regards to solidarity in practice, a lot of people really embody solidarity, right? So they think about the fact that they have children, therefore other children suffering is something horrible. But for instance, I don't have children, and I think children suffering is horrible too, you know. But I don't need to necessarily articulate it through my childlessness or my children, you know. And I feel like this type of correlation as well as drawing parallels is a very kind of like widespread right pattern. And I don't even think it's bad because I think it has potential, right? Especially in order to draw kind of also like attention to the systemic nature of how imperial and colonial kind of forms of violence are interrelated. But I feel like the discussion needs to go beyond that. Like, for instance, in regards to Kashmir in Pakistan, people always like draw attention to the fact of how Kashmiris were shaped by Palestinians, you know, in from the Intifada, throwing stones and everything, you know, and then suddenly how Kashmiris were doing the same towards the occupying Indian army. And that is true, you know, because I think we should also acknowledge the fact that people see, learn, and kind of apply certain learnings in their realities, but we can't kind of like reduce it to that single conversation because even though Israel and India are, you know, like politically collaborating and are also relating a lot of their kind of like measures of violence towards each colonized people, there are still specificities, you know, like that don't necessarily correlate and that are very unique to that single situation. For instance, like when I always think about the occupation in Palestine and I need to kind of like, I need to translate our occupation, it doesn't really work that way. You know, if I, for instance, if I took you to Ilam, you know, and I would show you that the kind of way of how occupation works for us, you would see a lot of differences. And I think there's a qualitative difference that makes specific kind of realities quite unique. And and it is not what is it? It is not a I'm not trying to say that what is happening to this group is worse than what is happening to the other, but I think we should be able to also be able to speak about these differences and how these differences create specific type of realities, right? Like for instance, like the fact that Palestinians are divided between three different territories in historic Palestine and then divided all across the world as refugees, you know, like these are very specific realities, you know, that don't necessarily, for instance, apply to other populations like Darfurians or West Cameroonians or other people, you know. And I think these differences to me are very important to kind of also stay true to that one specific history. And I think we have this urge to constantly speak globally without locally. And to me, I think it's actually much more productive to speak in a locally kind of like adjusted and also embedded way, which means that when I speak about Palestine, I want to speak about Palestine. I don't want to speak about Tamil, for instance, you know.
Mm.
And then when I speak about Kashmir, I don't want to speak about Rohingyas, for instance. I speak about Kashmir. But so I don't know, like it's a very that's what I'm trying to practice, but I feel like a lot of times how people kind of like receive it and what people take away from it is something different, right?
Right. I mean, but it kind of goes back to this concept is our struggles are not, you have this major issue in your book, right? And it's and it's the phrase Palestine frees us all, or if
Mm.
or something along those lines. And yeah, you have first of all, it's just not true. Like, I mean, we always say, yeah, Palestine frees us all, and when Palestine's free, we're all free. And of course, I understand where it comes from, and I understand the like, especially in the geopolitical sense when it concerns like the Arab and Middle Eastern world, because yeah, nearly every country is run by a dictator. But um, but yeah, but I guess I want more of your reaction to
Mm.
why you like vehemently dislike this phrase.
I mean, it would be nice if that was real, you know, like
Yeah.
I would not oppose it. But the fact is that it's an abstraction and it also creates a center, right? And to me, it's a very kind of colonial imperial logic because it centers certain oppressions and kind of also renders other oppressions as a side effect into side conversations that are only like linked as appendix of that one conversation, right? And it also does injustice towards Palestinians because it kind of abstracts Palestinians from their own very land-based issue, you know, and it renders Palestine into a metaphor for the world, which it's not, because it's a very real struggle and it's a very real suffering that is very localized, you know, and these phrases kind of give us, I think they're like rhetorical tools that are quite easily deployed as a way to shorten some kind of thought processes and some kind of like conversations. And whilst their intentions, I think, are right and they're good, you know, I think the reality is so apart from it. And it actually does, in many ways, create also harm because it really also allows people to focus on Palestine as a reference point to focus on every other oppressed and colonized people. And in doing that, I think we are really creating a center and a periphery, and that is not the logic of any anti-colonial struggle, right?
Yeah, but here, so this is what I think about this. I constantly ask my question, and by the way, this is something that the Zionists and imperialists always specifically ask is, oh, why don't you fight for Palestine? Why don't you fight for all of these other
Mm.
things? And I actually take that question seriously. I ask myself, what is it about Palestine that seems that acts so universal to a
Mm.
lot of these activists that are the major issues on university campuses? Why are the students fighting so much for it? And I think it's because Palestine, like this is sort of my analysis, but I'd love to hear also what you think. I feel like Palestine is, when you talk about an active decolonization, process, or the act of immediate colonization, and all of the textbook, villains are participating in that. And not just that, not only are they participating, not only is Germany, Britain, France, all of the caricature colonialists, but also they're implementing it inward. So in Germany, we feel this huge repression if we talk about this one thing, which makes us want to sort of talk about it more. Like the more you resist, the more someone, tries to punch you down, the more you want to talk about something.
Mm.
And the United States, it's taken now currently such a huge effort to silence and to criminalize and to detain and abduct people for not wanting to be complicit in the crimes against the Palestinians. So I think where it comes from, like for me, oh, if Palestine's free is we're all free, it is actually very Western. It's a very
Mm.
Western concept because in a way, in some instances, if Palestine is free, then some people are free to some people have more freedom of speech in the United States and Germany, right? Like complete the sentence, I think.
Mhm.
So it could be, in my opinion, it could be true in some cases. I mean, Lebanon would also have a sense of freedom and sovereignty if if Palestine was free, and also
Mhm.
Syria and also other countries. So yeah, I think the reason why it's become such a universal thing is because of how much the caricature colonialists have embodied the Israeli colonialist project.
Mhm. I mean, I agree. I think it's like Palestine wouldn't have the focus wasn't about Israel, right? Like I feel like
Yeah.
Palestine is is centered because of Israel, not because of
Yeah.
Palestine, you
Yeah.
know?
Okay, that's a very good.
In the same way, I feel like a lot of people like when people always say like Palestine is complicated or the conflict is complicated, you know. I think it's the opposite. It's actually one of the least complicated issues, which makes it also so easy to tap into because it's also an issue that everyone has an opinion about. Even the most remotely placed and apolitical person will have an opinion about, a feeling about it, you know, like whereas
Yeah.
in regards to other issues, they will not have a feeling. And I think a lot of it also has to do it's because it's an almost kind of like an old-fashioned type of colonialism, you know, in the way like you have a majority European population, you know, against an indigenous population, you know, and these setups create also like a framework to understand and to also react towards it that are maybe much more easier to handle because they also like push us back to the history of Algeria. They push us back to all kinds of like previous colonial histories, you know, like from the so-called 20th century and 21st century, you know, and that allows for a lot of people to read it in a way quite differently than, let's say, a project of colonization where the colonizer and the colonized don't look so different and where they're both maybe they previously were colonized by Europeans, you know, and then one of them became a colonizer, you know, like in the tradition of Europeans, and that is oftentimes creates like this overwhelmedness because people cannot distinct like draw that distinction between who is colonized and who's the colonizer, you know, and that I think pushes a lot of people into maybe more easier kind of like activism. I wouldn't say easier, but maybe a type of activism that is much easier to the eye, you
Yeah.
know, and a type of kind of like reaction that confirms also with a way of how we learned about European colonization. Because I feel in many ways this is like many other projects, it's an unfinished project of decolonization, you know, and also like a product, of course, of that process. And in that way, I feel like a lot of people ta are maybe are better equipped to respond to it than to speak about, for instance, Ethiopia or any other country, you know, that colonizes internally, and where you have to kind of read more, but also be much more sensitive also to your visual kind of perception.
Yeah. So, but how do you interpret so my question is, and maybe this is even colonial in its articulation, but I'm just going to ask it anyway for the sake of it. The Palestinian people and the South African people have developed a lot of time in speaking to the international community, but
Mm,
also in terms of just how and how they have developed a diaspora in itself. Maybe that has something to do with it. But the language in which Palestinian resistance has formulated is that it speaks to the international world and what to do to combat, Israeli colonialism.
mm,
And my question is to you, and I could be totally ignorant of this, but how does this all translate, for example, to like the Tamil struggle? Like,
mm,
how like so when a people is giving direct asks to the international, they pretty much laid it out for the
mm,
world to just sort of do. But
mm.
how does that translate in other places?
I feel like the Palestinian position is quite specific also and unique in the sense that Palestine has a recognized, non-recognized state, right? In the sense that Palestine has an official representation at the UN. It has kind of like certain types of kind of access to institutions which other struggles really lack, which
Oh,
means that their way of kind of also like accessing the so-called world stage is quite a different one. It kind of goes through back doors, it goes through solidarity movement and through other kinds of stakeholders. But I think every movement addresses the world. I just feel like the ways of how far their kind of calls, you know, like resonate is different, you know. And I think in regards to South Africa and Palestine, I mean, these are all like settler colonial, European settler colonial projects, you know. And in that sense, they also like respond in that very historical manner of how we think about a European body in a very specific geography, you know, and how that creates what kind of issues that has in regards to indigenous populations. But for instance, like for us as Elam Tamils, like we struggle a lot with the so-called global South because the Global South has completely kind of sided with the Sri Lankan state, who has employed and really like weaponized this Global South rhetoric as well as the anti-imperial rhetoric as a way to delegitimize the Tamil struggle as an external kind of force that is in the interest of the empires, you know. And in these regards, you see that there's a much more cynical as well as sinister way of how rhetoric that might work in regards to Palestine and South Africa, for instance, does not work in the case of a country like so-called Sri Lanka, you know, where the state has also been at the forefront of the non-aligned movement, right? That was one of the founding states that was also part of the very core members with Nasser and all these other people who were running that show, right? So they're very equipped. And for instance, I used to be like years ago, I used to be active in lobbying and everything at the UN level. And one of the biggest issues that we had was actually lobbying like global southern states, you know, countries like Algeria, like Cuba, you know, which are historically always considered as allies, for instance, to Palestine, to South Africa, and other places, and struggles that have been vehemently opposing, for instance, us. Because they've completely kind of like bought in as well as sided with the rhetoric as well as the political kind of like framing that so-called Sri Lanka has employed and also exploited, you know. So for instance, for us, and I think maybe that's similar to the Kurdish, you know, movement, that in many ways, like these rhetorics, like the West, for instance, has a very specifically maybe different role sometimes, you know, where oftentimes we have sometimes better relationships, even with a country like the UK, which is our former colonizer, you know, than for instance with Thailand, you know, and that creates like a very kind of like maybe globally speaking skewed kind of conversations, but I think in their kind of own reality, coherent still.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the very reason I texted you to say we need to have a discussion
Mm,
is because I watched just part of the debate between, or like the interview between Mahdi Hassan and the leader of Sri Lanka, or as you say it, so-called Sri Lanka. And I was like, it was deja vu. It was just like, what's happening? Like,
mm,
I was so angry for that type of non-response of the gaslighting and and the justification for genocidal crimes. I mean, what I didn't know, however, is Sri Lanka's positioning within the global South.
mm,
Um and I guess I want to ask you just the foundational question of solidarity, because um I mean, yeah, like this is you, and you use in your book, you use the phrase of Palestine washing, and you use Morocco as an example. And I think it was absolutely spot on. You said the Moroccan team, they put the Palestine flags, they garnered international support. Palestinians themselves were very excited. But the major issue is, they weren't lobbying their government and protesting the actual relations between Israel and Morocco. Like
mm,
that was a clear example of what you call Palestine washing. So yeah, I mean, I don't even know if I have a question for this. It's just sort of
mm,
it's just sort of outrageous to me, and I want to kind of pinpoint and just talk about what is true solidarity. And I have had such a hard time trying to answer this question. I just really would like to. I know it's a big one,
yeah.
but I would like to sort of reach something by the end of
Mm.
this conversation, as you try masterfully in your book as well.
Thank you. I mean, I don't think there's an all-out answer. I feel like there is no universal response to like solidarity. I think we need to consider solidarity always as a response to a lack of something or a collapse of something, right? Um, and therefore that kind of like deficit or absence of something needs to be responded to or is asked to be responded to by others, right? And that means that it needs to be very specific, and specific issues need specific responses, right? And therefore, I don't think there is a clear answer to that, except for the fact that I think one of the things that I find very meaningful and very important is the act of witnessing and acknowledging someone's suffering. And that is maybe like a very impotent way of acting because it also speaks to our lack of power of actually changing these realities. But one of the things that a lot of like violated people are frustrated about is the fact that their suffering isn't reaching or it doesn't matter, you know. And as much as we cannot change a lot of the policies that, for instance, governments design, you know, at the expenses of colonized populations, I think there's something about the act of rendering someone feel seen. That it sounds very like superficial, but in the sense that acknowledging someone's living but also suffering and dying, and that is a very kind of like I think an elemental part that is oftentimes banalized, but
Yeah.
that I've like realized like in 2009 when the genocide was going on in Devani, for instance, it was one of the worst things that we experienced. You know, like we've lost 170,000 people within a span of 5 to 9 months. And the fact that at the end of it, the state still held on to its rhetoric of having said it killed no civilians. And then secondly, it also kept on kind of like diminishing the numbers, reducing them to 2,000, 3,000, or something, which creates kind of like a margin of 167,000 people or something, you know? And the question that I was oftentimes concerned and also distraught with was what is it when 167,000 people, you know, like just become a statistical number that can be erased, that can be negotiated and be questioned in its very existence? What does that mean in regards to our lives, to our deaths? And in that sense, one of the things that I find from a Tamil perspective, like very like one of the saddest part in our history was the fact that so much suffering has happened, and yet we still have to explain it to people as if it wasn't like a given, you know, and as if it wasn't like something that should have reached them in other ways, you know. And so in that sense, I kind of feel like listening to people, encountering, you know, like concerned people, actually allowing them to speak, to be patient, to be open to the critique that they make, the frustrations that they voice, and then to amplify it, and then to kind of also like display that type of, you know, like act of witnessing, act of responding, and not just muting yourself and kind of becoming like what's the word, like so passive, you know. And but I don't know, like I feel like every situation really requires specific type of responses, and I can only speak like from my own kind of like frustrations and my own reaction. Like I would have at that moment, I would have, because we were very similar to Palestinians today. We were for months on the streets, you know, like we dropped out of universities, you know, like we were just constantly like blocking, occupying spaces. But people were still asking us like, what's going on? Even though all our banners, they weren't very like they were very graphic, you know. So they had images, they had slogans, they spoke to the violence, but people still didn't recognize the fact that this was real. And this kind of feeling that a lot of this violence creates that we're not real is something that I feel like is something that we can practically combat, even as outsiders of that history.
Right. I mean, I'm not even sure how to follow up with that on. I just one of the things that was very prominent for me in your book was when you spoke about your time in the refugee camps. And I would love if you sort of speak about it to the participants. And I just want to say that, by the way, we're at 100 here, but apparently it's maxed. My Zoom plan was maxed at 100, and so many other people, like my phone is off the hook because so many people can't enter and they're freaking out. So I'm really sorry, and I will post this in full at a later date. But I just want to and also as a housekeeping thing, you could please feel free to send me your questions also. And towards the end of our conversation, I'll if we have time, I'll definitely get to them. But yeah, sorry. Back to my main point is I
Mhm.
really would love if you spoke about, you know, this feeling of what your how you developed the consciousness of like what solidarity should mean while you were in these refugee camps, which I believe you describe as sort of the fundamental, you know, part of your understanding of it.
Mhm. I mean, I like to think about solidarity less from a meta level than, you know, like from a micro level, and how we practice solidarity in our day to day, you know, and how it's not necessarily oftentimes framed or understood as something political, even though it's something deeply political. And I think it's a consciousness that we also develop. So, In the book, like I talk about the years that we spent in refugee camps. So I grew up in a refugee camp. I was born in one. So I lived for the first 7 years in one. And within these years, if you're not familiar with Germany, like Germany has this very old system of refugee camps, which are dispersed all across the countries. They're mostly in rural areas, and then they're at the like very commonly at the very in very kind of like peripheral areas, like cut off from infrastructure, cut off from kind of society, which renders them into very isolated spaces. So we grew up in these spaces, and in these spaces, in many ways, they kind of create their own economy, as well as force you into kind of like an enactment of a collective kind of like existence where different people kind of encounter each other, like from different parts of the world, different struggles and histories, who are then forced into this very small space and very like dehumanizing space, and then have to kind of manage that space. And when I was thinking about the refugee camp, I always thought about the kind of like the politics of the spatial kind of politics, the architecture, and in how many ways, the architecture is designed to create discomfort, to create kind of like pain, to continue the suffering of the detained population. But refugees, of course, in many ways also counteracted, like in very kind of like direct ways, in, for instance, in organizing the space, in decorating the space, in creating kind of like ways of actually making it a livable space, and their existence in the camp into something that's worthwhile, because the state constantly keeps on telling you that you're disposable population, therefore you are in a refugee camp. But refugees themselves oftentimes invert that kind of like interpretation by giving themselves meaning and value, within the camps. And to me, like some of the things that I really found quite striking, as well as something that really shaped me, was the ways of how we organized our food plans, our cooking plans, our cleaning plans, as well as how we organized, for instance, going to the doctors, because the doctors were miles away. So we had to kind of like get a car, no one had licenses, no one had a car, of course. So you had to kind of like interact with different people and then coordinate, like to kind of like meet your everyday needs. And these are in many ways, to me, like is the core of what it means to kind of like be in relationship with each other, because I think solidarity is a relationship from an individual to another, but also from collectives to other collectives and groups. And in that way, it kind of like broke it down to a very kind of micro level, where you were faced with a very kind of like violent reality, and everyone was trying to kind of like navigate that, and then making the best out of it through the numbers and the abilities of each of them. And that to me, I think, was something that really shaped also my understanding, I think, of how we interact with each other. Because I think I'm generally like less concerned with, even though this book that we wrote is very much like concerned about online expression and social media kind of critique, I am much more interested in how in our everyday, how we deal with each other, and in that sense, I feel like we also like live in this kind of weird time where people um kind of like have these very like reductive ways of speaking about, like not showing gratitude, for instance, and of course it's always framed, like the German states, for instance, asks us, like foreigners, to be grateful for having being taken up in this country, or being giving a stay or something, and a lot of people in our generation, they reject that, which I completely understand, but then when I look at my parents' generation, I see the opposite, like they actually like express that gratitude oftentimes,
Yeah.
and that gratitude is oftentimes, it's so directly linked to their own frame of reference, which is the violence of the states that they fled from. So even though this state is also violent, their sense of kind of relating and measuring that violence is based on their reference points, right? And to me, I feel like I always think about like everyday interactions. Like, for instance, say you walk on the street, like someone attacks you or something, and someone else comes to help you. Of course, you'll say thank you to that person. You won't say, yes, you did what you should have done, right? And in that everyday interaction, I kind of feel like it kind of speaks also to a kind of global way of how we could relate to each other in a much more I don't know if empathetic is the word that I would use, but I think in a much more genuine and also acknowledging way, because I don't expect people, like for instance, like when you invited me and you said thank you, I always said like don't say thank you, but I would say thank you too, I would say thank you too, because I think there's a courtesy and a respectfulness and an acknowledgement of the act of you're actually making an effort.
Yeah.
And I would never take that effort for granted. And I think to me that is something that I hold dear and want to kind of like maintain as a core of how I interact with people.
I, I feel like we're very different people. I mean, I, I don't express gratitude often. I'm usually not that
Mm.
grateful, and maybe and this sort of becomes in my refusal to accept my situation. I mean, you were talking about your parents, and I immediately heard, that was my parents too. I mean, my parents never wanted to me. So, but by the way, my first introduction to activism or solidarity work was actually tackling school segregation in New York City. So, I was at one of the type high schools in New York City. I was one of the only Muslims, and it was a majority white public school. And right behind my high school, it was a housing project for black kids that couldn't get into the high school because of how competitive it was. And so my whole introduction to activism was tackling school segregation. And immediately my parents' initial reactions were, why are you doing this? Why are you causing a problem? Why are you going to this protest? And it was very, it was very frustrating. And I've developed this concept of lacking gratitude because I'm always angry and frustrated over
Mm.
the situation. And mostly because I've never got to learn about what it means to be a Palestinian person and what exactly I missed out on and what my children are missing out on. And even the conversation for today, it was very hard to get in the mind space of trying to have this talk. And I it's and it felt like being a Palestinian is all encompassing and all um and traumatic in all of its sense. But my point is to that is I've figured out what it means to be Palestinian entirely on my own. And it was because of my parents' sort of this gratitude that you mentioned towards the state. Um I I rejected that, and through this rejection I learned about what it means to be a Palestinian, and why is it that I was even living in New York City, and why
Mm.
is it that I'm currently now in Germany, and my husband who spent his childhood in Gaza, and
Mm.
and his family is being slaughtered as we speak. And so it's yeah, again, it's through it's through this rejection of gratitude. And of course,
Mm.
it's not about a interpersonal level. It's about about space, about yeah, like rejecting it through a you know that goes beyond just the personal.
Mm.
But what I wanted to really ask you though is did, how did you become I know our realities are very different because you grew up in a refugee camp, you spent time in a refugee camp, but the access to knowledge and when your grandparents or parents tell you about the repression and persecution they face, how do they, how does that couple with with feeling any sort of gratitude? They're not supposed to be in this foreign
Mm.
land to begin with.
I mean, I think I don't feel gratitude towards Germany, but I think I've also kind of gone through a kind of like trajectory of kind of rejecting my parents' reaction, and also policing my parents and telling them off for not feeling grateful, da da da. But I've also become more understanding, because I also understand that there's a difference between their positionality and mine, and there's a comfort and a privilege in mine that they don't share, So in that sense, I've become more soft maybe on them, even though I don't agree, but I understand, like
But
where
is
they're.
there a privilege? Is there really, because I don't, because part of it is if you of course react and build, be in spaces that are you towing the line of what's
Mm,
respectable to a state, then of course, that's fine. But
mm,
as we both know, when we try to speak in a liberatory sense for all, that isn't a very acceptable approach to
mm.
state hegemony. So
No,
are you privileged in that
I,
sense?
I think I'm privileged in relation to Ulam Tamils who are back home, right? And I think that is the relationship that I look at. I'm not looking at like I'm not comparing myself to I don't know Germans or others who live here,
Yeah.
but I'm specifically speaking about that relationship of what it means to live outside of that occupying force and outside of the violence of our immediate occupier. And of course, here we are also subject to like many related also forms of violence. But I still see that there's qualitative difference, which allows me to also kind of develop in a way that's so different, you know? And like personally, I also didn't grow up like my parents did not raise me politically, you know. My parents did not introduce me to our struggle. My parents were very conscious about separating us, you know, like from the struggle. And they always made a point by saying that our suffering will end with us. And you are here, you know, like this is a new life we've given you.
Be happy.
Yes, and make the most out of it, you know? Like don't get into trouble, don't get into like don't critique too much, don't be too loud, don't
Yeah.
give yourself a name and this and that, you know? And but of course that's not how life works, you know, and that's also not how families work, you know? And oftentimes the ways of how our parents would do it was that they would whenever they would watch the news and stuff, they would, you know, like push us away or put us into our rooms, you know, and keep us away from any types of kind of interaction. So my own knowledge was very superficial. Like I knew we were persecuted, I knew our people were killed, I knew our people were fleeing, and I knew that the state was causing us trouble, you know. But there was nothing beyond that. And I think only like in my teenage years I started to also become more interested and intrigued. Specifically, I was frustrated with my own ignorance because I was quite early on, I was very much a news person. Like as a child, I would be obsessed with watching the news, learning about, you know, like all kinds of issues and stuff. But I would give very little time and effort into understanding and reading our own history. And when the tsunami in 2004 happened, you know, and more than 35,000 people died on the island, and the majority in Elam. And the state was limiting relief to go into Elam, and they were kind of like monopolizing it and sending it towards Sinhalese people in the south. And I was kind of dragged into what is it like, a relief work, you know, like networks and everything. That's the first time when I kind of became a little bit outraged about myself and my ignorance, and also frustrated with my own parents, you know, because I started blaming them for having artificially kind of like kept me away and denied me part of my history. And that to me has become like a learning that I then individually also went about, you know, and read and learned, which I'm still grateful for because I do think I I'm grateful for the fact that I learned it the way I did and not necessarily through just my parents, because I could also critically interrogate my parents' kind of like, you know, like understandings and political analysis of things. But in regards to gratitude, I think I don't know. I feel like also like culturally, like I like that's the way I was raised in many ways, you know. And so in that sense, I always feel like there's a reflex, you know, like where I also like start to regulate my anger and manage my anger and reduce my anger and try to also like channel it where I think it's constructive. And that is sometimes helpful, but also sometimes it makes you a little bit into makes you seem maybe sterile, you know, and a little bit apathetic.
Yeah, yeah. I have so many, I have so many questions, but I just want to kind of get back into your pursuit and trying to figure out about your struggle. Um,
Mm.
in your book, you talk about sort of how difficult it is to try to learn in a way that is in essence like a decolonial approach to understanding, what it is to be Palestinian, what it is to be Elam Tamil. And my question to you is how did you personally navigate the traps of figuring things out, only through a Western or European
Mm.
yeah, source. Because I mean, even if we do search on the internet and search, we have this knowledge base, it's still very, very biased. I mean,
Mm.
our search engines, our access to resources, our abilities to understand in many ways, a lot of it is also just oral histories too.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, so how did you go about your understanding yeah, of your struggle, but also of other struggles? Like how did you become yeah, this a person who understands how important it is to have solidarity with different struggles?
Mm. I think when I started to become politicized, there was already like um, a little bit of an infrastructure of knowledge. There were a couple of websites. So this was in the period of the so-called ceasefire. in the early 2000s, where some of the websites were already like historicizing, archiving a lot of our histories, like Tamil websites. So I was mostly like learning through them and reading, like the historical kind of facts and information through them. But also, when I moved to London after I finished my A levels here, I quickly got in touch with a lot of like Tamil organizations. There's the Tamil Information Center in the UK, and all of them they have also like a lot of like archival materials, and you quickly get into more community-based kind of like history writings. And I think something that we lack that, for instance, Palestinians have is like we don't have many outside commentators, like who write like books about us, which also means that they're more difficult to find. Also, like when you want to read them in imperial languages, European ones, but it also maybe frees you from a lot of the garbage, and the shitty kind of takes that outsiders may have on your own struggle. So in that sense, it allowed me to kind of be more precise in my reading but to also isolate a lot of like the readings that might distract, like but even to me it was a very like I had a bit of a learning like I used to have a more liberal kind of stance, where I was also quite critical of the resistance, and I was a little bit like at odds with some of the policies, which I still am, but there were like certain acts of the state that kind of pushed me into a much more kind of radical position where I was able to kind of reposition also my own kind of like stance on things. And in regards to other struggles, I think I don't know if it's like a side effect, like one of the fact that Tamil Elam and the Elam Tamil struggle has never been centered on a global stage, also forces you to kind of like become more knowledgeable of other things, right? And other struggles. Like it doesn't allow you to kind of like sit in a place of comfort in the sense that you can sit with your own history and that will be considered to be legitimate or sufficient enough to speak about the world. Like I could never say something about Tamil Elam that would be like rendered into a universal kind of reality that everyone would kind of like be able to respond to. Like I would have to kind of like create bridges kind of like parallels. I would have to dig out histories that might be more easily digestible for outsiders that then kind of bring us back or allow us to go back to Elam. And I think this type of sidelining and invisibilizing of our struggle also made me maybe a better reader, and made me forced me into becoming a more cognizant and a more observant person who is also interested in other struggles as a way, maybe as a strategy also to reinforce and re-amplify our own struggle.
Yeah.
And I feel like the more central your struggle are is maybe in Western international spaces, the less you're kind of forced, I think, oftentimes as a by effect to also read into other struggles because other struggles will move towards you more likely than you have to move towards them. And this act of us having to move towards others also, like when you, for instance, look into Tamil, like from the liberation movements, kind of historical, kind of like pamphlets, like publications and everything, they will always make references to the Namibian struggle, to the Palestinian struggle, the Kurdish struggle, the Eritrean struggle, and so on and so forth, and this type of like strategy to force yourself in the global stage by kind of like also pushing yourself, almost latching on to other struggles. Uh, is something I think is the result of us being in a very specific kind of like peripheral geography.
So, Sinthujan, I have to say, I first off, I very much appreciate in your pursuit and how you definitely went about it, and I feel like people can take it individually, but let's sort of switch to the
Mm,
collective because something that I've and I expressed this sort of in the beginning and on the phone with you earlier that I am always just vehemently angry about the concept of solidarity and just how it translates. I'm particularly angry in how it has translated from the Muslim community. I find it, I personally find it disgusting, and how they've not collectively just not shown up in an institutional and a collective way within Germany. And I have two questions about this. One, how do we move beyond the individual? And I see a couple questions here that sort of want to move away from the emotional, the consciousness. Okay, let's say we have all of this. Let's say how do we translate that sort of into the collective. And my second question to you is, do you think that I'm seeing, solidarity from the Muslim community in a wrong way that is that actually isn't helpful to the Palestinian movement? Like I tend to look at things through also just a spiritual lens of
Mm,
I believe in a concept of called like divine rage, and I believe in
mm,
divine justice. And I think that if anyone has any sort of semblance to that, they should also, or relation or similarities to me in that way. They should stand up for the Palestinian people. But I also would like to hear your, maybe critique on that understanding in that way. So two questions for you. How do we move from the individual to the collective? And yeah, like what's your take on Muslims in Germany?
mm. I mean, like people always use, like the phrase of we need to organize, right? And I think it's of course, that's the right response. But in the question that I always have, like, what do you mean? Like,
Yeah,
it's so easily said, but it's so difficult to translate into actual
doesn't
actions.
mean anything anymore. That's the
Yes,
problem.
exactly. And to me, like what I found always was helpful is to actually like either like seek for groups that are already organized, or to kind of like found your own groups, like and to kind of like step into actions that are responding maybe to a local kind of like reality, say in Mannheim or in Berlin or somewhere, and then kind of connect with other existing groups, and then to create a more kind of like maybe a national network or something, and that I find is a more helpful way. To kind of like take it to another like level. But also I feel like all of us have different skills, right? And knowing our own skills, I think we can also offer them to other groups that already exist that are running, like to kind of like I don't know, like offer like the ability to speak, to write, to maybe enhance things, to edit, like and maybe to produce posters, to provide like technical kind of stuff, equipment, like for protests, like these kinds of things. I feel like they're very hands-on and they can be done if we move away from a more kind of passive observing kind of stage into a more active kind of like how can we respond to something in a more proactive way. In regards to the Muslim community, I mean, the German context is very specific, right? In the sense that I feel like a lot of the frustrations that you see here, like a lot of the anti-racist movements that existed in the 2010s, have been very idle towards the question of Palestine, right? And very much in silence, which I think is I think it deserves the critique that it gets. I don't think it receives enough critique because I think it deserves even more because it's actually like a complete failure and a complete kind of collapse of that kind of like shallow type of politics that has nationalized issues because a lot of the anti-racist movement and even the anti-Islamophobia movement and anti-Muslim racism movement in Germany has kind of like self-isolated itself to a national reality, right? And they've only responded towards Germany as its own entity and its own kind of social and political entity, but they have never dared to actually make it into a more global kind of like response. And to me, I see the frustration as well, and I'm not even Palestinian and neither Muslim, and I'm frustrated to see that. And I think um, it's an utter failure that speaks to the fact that a lot of people have been very comfortable, right? And there's also like a kind of co-option of critique that happened through the state, through diversity and other anti-racism actions by the state, which allowed for a lot of people to build careers, like through state means, state funding and whatsoever. And a lot of people are much more comfortable in kind of continuing that relationship with the state than to actually kind of like be in opposition,
I mean, they're
whilst
learning that that's not working anymore. Like
it's
that's
not
not
working.
gonna
Yeah.
protect them anymore.
But I think a lot of people, not the problem, but I think the reality is that people will speak up oftentimes and stand up until they will lose something, right? And I think that is the reality for the majority of people. And I feel like a lot of people then end up domesticating their frustration and they don't necessarily like voice it in the way and in the moments and towards the people that they should in order to also comfort a certain type of reality. And I don't know how to break that. And I think maybe because I've never thought of the Palestinian struggle as a Muslim struggle, for instance, I don't come from that reality.
Yeah.
So therefore, for me, it's always been an anti-colonial struggle, and I've always kind of like related to it as an anti-colonial struggle. And maybe that is the more realistic kind of like takeaway as well, that the Ummah will only respond to a certain degree towards the issue. But actually, I mean, we've seen like how much
No
support
such thing as
Palestine or
anymore.
Hmm?
No, there's no such thing as a
Yeah,
as
yeah, but I think when we think about even the fact about how the UAE is dealing with Israel, Morocco is dealing with Israel, Sudan, and all these other Egypt whatsoever, like all these countries, you see how these kind of notions have been instrumentalized. And in many ways, when we listen to Palestinians, for instance, on, like different kind of media channels, like one of the first things that they say, a lot of them is the frustration, yeah, towards the Muslim world and the Arab world, right? And I think that is maybe also disappointment towards a false narrative that has been produced and that has created maybe a level of relatedness and closeness, which is now showing in its artificiality and in its kind of like limits. And I think the frustration should be there, but I think it's also maybe something useful for tomorrow, maybe even or today, to also kind of collaborate more with groups and people who actually don't necessarily frame themselves only through these notions, but actually through those very material anti-colonial struggles. And these struggles are autonomous from religious affiliation, from religious affiliation and cultural kind of like notions. And I think when we break it down to the core of that, like it is able for me to completely be in solidarity with Palestinians without being from any Abrahamic faith,
yeah.
and that is not the leading, because my values in believing in anti-colonialism push me to also support people who have nothing in common with me. Maybe that brings us back to the point that you started off with, right? The fact that oftentimes we want to see ourselves in struggles and we see ourselves in the relationship. And from my own Muslim friends, like non-Palestinian Muslim friends, I always had this frustration that oh, they didn't even see Palestinians anymore. They saw themselves, And then Palestine becomes an abstraction for Muslim subjectivity,
Of
in the
course.
same way of how Rohingyas at some point also became, like an abstraction for, and that to me is actually like a false conclusion and a
Mm.
lethal conclusion because it also denies Palestinian plurality, but also Palestinians' materiality, which is not just through religion.
Right, yeah, no, of course, and it's sort of it infantilizes the Palestinian people where all of these different groups that think that they're seeing their humanity and in reality are projecting their own belief systems,
Mm.
ideologies, and and acting on what they see fit in order to fight for the Palestinian people.
But that
For
was also
me, yeah,
a strategy, right? Like when we think about how Israel hollowed out the PLO and everything, like in the way of how that framed or reframed the Palestinian struggle in the recent decades, like there was a strategy also to
yeah,
shift away. And I feel like a lot of times, a lot of our adversaries are also very keen on moving away from traditional anti-colonial like rhetoric as well as imageries in order to create kind of like more mismatched interpretations of the issues, which make it more difficult maybe to respond to them.
yeah, no, of course. I want to get to the question. I have so
Mhm.
many questions for you, but I want to get to the core, like the crux of the issue here for me. Our major thing is connecting with different groups on the ground and organizing together as a collective, not each individually. And that's something that I very much agree with. I mean, something that I felt I very much vehemently oppose is acting as if Palestine is unique in one way or
Mm.
even or other liberation struggles are unique in one way. Like, I mean, the type and the process of dehumanization that occurs against the Palestinian people occurred against the Tamil people, occurred against what's going on in Sudan right now. It's very much the process of dehumanization is very much a universal way, and Germans act like they invented it, but I digress. I wanted to ask you about the problems, however, that you run into when you try to organize with different groups, and you talk about it at the beginning of your
Mm,
book, you go to a Palestine protest and you see these different these different types of people get into a confrontations if they see a Kurdish flag, if a Turkish person sees a Kurdish flag, or if yeah, if a Sahrawi person sees a Moroccan flag, or if a pro-regime Syrian sees the Free Syrian flag. I mean, there I can't tell you how many times I had to navigate trying to not get it wrong also,
mm,
like, and but so this sort of goes into your major argument of like the hierarchies
mm,
of solidarity, and what is how do I, like, as a person who's working in these fields, um try not to split between these groups and try to see people's perspective, but like at the end of the day, there is an oppressed and there is an oppressor. Maybe that's reductive to say, but I wanted to get your reaction to this. Like, this is a major issue in the
mm,
pro-Palestinian scene in Berlin, and but also just across the world.
mm. I mean, I think because Palestine has become such an abstract that it's not necessarily about the political kind of demands and the political kind of reality that a lot of like oppressors also are identifying with Palestine,
Right.
right? And then are
Like,
outraged about the genocide in Gaza, but then they're also cheering for the bombing of Rojava, for instance, right? And these types of clashes, I think they maybe happen more likely, I think, in terms of the Palestinian issue, and I think in Palestinian organizing, I think one of the solutions they had in Berlin was to prohibit other flags. So which I think was a very hands-on approach. They
I mean, that's
basically
we did this, we did this, something similar in Frankfurt and also in Mannheim. Yeah.
I think it's useful because I'm just like, what is this flag doing there anyway? Like, you don't need to express your solidarity through other flags, and I feel like there's a nationalizing also of solidarity, which I find sometimes a little bit like cringy. But I think I don't know. I feel like generally, maybe this is also very specific, I think, to the Palestinian cause, is that so many other people read and identify with it that there needs to be
The
like there needs to be
mediator.
some. Hmm?
Like a mediator between all of these.
Yes, yeah, 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 and I think um like it's difficult to also like because a protest, of course, is an open space, right? And you can't necessarily like manage it. You can't kind
Oh,
of like make gatekeep it as well. And therefore, I think it's for organizers, it's a very kind of like practical kind of like difficulties of how do you engage with that. But I think it is also a very kind of constructive real like kind of coming together because it really also shows us the reality that we face in the imperial centers where it's not just one single group, it's many different groups, and they share spaces. They kind of like they collide, sometimes, and then it's almost like how do we deal with this kind of like rupture that happens in between it, and a lot of people are like, well, this problem is now distracting from the actual core of why we came here, and that may be true, but then it's like
there is a hierarchy then, because now
yes, yeah, yeah.
you're prioritizing, Palestine over, this confrontation that dehumanizes, whichever direction the dehumanization
Hmm.
is coming from. And this is my major issue is, do I now, but of course you're someone who looks at space, and of course trying to figure out when is the right time and space to dictate all of these questions. But one of the major issues for me is, okay, but as a group, do I need to be taking stances on each, as, let's say, working as a collective, do I need to take a stance on, what's going on in Syria and Kurdistan, and what's going on with all of these different conflicts, in order to have principle, like,
Hmm.
or is that counterintuitive, and it's impossible for a collective group to be making those decisions to begin with.
I think I I personally I like stances, and I think it's the more principled way of doing politics. Because when I think about a lot of the resistance movements that we have globally, a lot of them push out statements of solidarity, right? And these statements of solidarity are also rejections of someone else's politics, right? So in that sense, they're also like clearly aligning themselves with something, but also rejecting something else. And this type of politics creates also a kind of like a value kind of base, and also a clarity in their stance towards a specific kind of principle. And I think more groups, I would, and it doesn't require much. I kind of feel like when once you've pushed out your politics in a way that it becomes so yeah, what's the word? Like it becomes so uncompromising that like adversaries can never join it because they understand that what this group is standing for also kind of like implies that they may also stand for free West Sahara. That already kind of like creates a space that maybe more nurturing, and that is actually also maybe cleared off a lot of like people who might have very different politics on other issues. So I do think I would wish more groups to make more statements. Like
Yeah.
I was also thinking about coming together as a new Tamil collective, making more kind of like proactively kind of responding to issues in a way to also create a guideline, because I kind of feel like oftentimes we wait for someone else to do it,
Yeah.
and then only when someone else has done it we kind of feel like maybe encouraged to also take a similar kind of like direction. But there needs to be someone to start it, and to kind of like put out a clear point, and for that you need to have someone to kind of like uh more like lead the way.
Yeah. So then my question to you is about and I feel like we did touch on this before, but the process of reciprocity then.
Hmm.
And how is it crucial in when like advocating for a space. I'm really trying to actively decenter Palestine and so but it keeps going back because it's all encompassing right now, especially in this moment. But let's just say like just organizing groups in general, they're organizing as a collective. How important is it for reciprocity within that group? And it goes back to the this major question that you do address in your book about whether solidarity is transactional.
Hmm. I mean, I think reciprocity is a core of relationships, right? I kind of feel like I mean, it's like with friendships, right? Like if you don't invest equally into a friendship, you will see an outcome that might not necessarily be the one that you've envisioned, right? And I do think that specifically when people, of course, when people a more powerful group meets or powerful individual meets a less powerful one, of course,
Yes.
reciprocity.
Oh, now I can't even say it.
Yeah, it means or looks different than when people, like who are in a more equitable kind of like position, And I think oftentimes whenever like people ask for something in return, people dismiss it as transactional. And I have an issue with that because I think in everyday relationships, we would never think of, like an act of giving and then also like receiving as something that would be something equitable, that would be something respectful, that would be common sense, right? Behavior that we live in our day to day quite actively, without necessarily thinking about it politically. So to me, I think that's a very kind of like a biological kind of reaction to, like a social grouping, So I don't see it as as a, what do you call it? Like it's not a contradiction to also extend that towards how different groups relate towards each other, like for instance, if someone is helpful towards me, I will not forget that, and in a moment of need I will also return that, like that same help, not because I think that that person is expecting, but because I know it's the right thing to do, like to be there for each other in a time of need. And I think if you break it down to this very like banal level, it makes sense. So therefore, to me, it should also make sense on a meta level, like whereas for instance, like if a group has kind of like stood up and voiced their opposition to what is happening to another group, I feel like if that other group also needs your help, we should also enact that, like, and we shouldn't think about it like, no, we shouldn't reduce it to something like, well, they're meant to do that. But if they're meant to do it, we're also meant to do it. Like
Mm,
it is a social relationship, and that
yeah.
relationship is based on sharing. And to me, like sharing has never been something negative. But if you frame it as transactional, that also means that you're disrespectful of something like equity, but also meeting each other, on Germans say like an auf Augenhöhe treffen, like to meet each other on an eye level, and that is part of a dignified and self-respectful presence and existence. So
Yeah.
I do think it's maybe you can tell me like what you feel about it.
No, my initial, of course, my gut reaction is to always take stances and to always have alliances and politically relevant alliances. Of course, this just, you as a person, I'm a very non-confrontational person. It doesn't seem like it because I'm always
Me neither.
like at
I'm the
something.
same.
But I really have an issue when someone doesn't like me or if someone, like I want to resolve it, like, but anyway, it's really difficult to manage when community members are people that you like and respect, and all of these things are, they don't want you to toe a specific line, or, for example, I live in Mannheim. It is predominantly Turkish people where I live. There's barely nearly any other, like, different ethnic groups that are here, and it's so when you take a stand about, and I'm speaking as an individual, not as a collective, just because, we haven't made a decision as a collective. But when I take a stand around Kurdistan, for example, this isolates a majority of the people in my community, and so no one will show up, right?
Mhm.
Of course, that is a moment when, okay, the solidarity is transactional, and solidarity is only when it meets your agenda. But I but it from a practical, logistical, like, let's say we need, like, sort of results now because there's a genocide going on. Um, it's really hard, and it's a scary thing to confront, because you don't want your whole community to just be against you all of a sudden.
Hmm.
And that's like and that's something that is a very real thing that could happen.
I think so, but then my question is always like, is that a community to hold on to, right? Like, or is that people to be in community with? Because I do think that people who don't follow principled stances are the type of people that I don't want to be in community with, and that I don't even want to kind of like have a stance or a say in regards to our issue, for instance, because I don't think they're genuine and they're fair-minded people, and I think when we think about injustice, like at a micro level, I'm just like it's very difficult to deny an injustice. Like you need to have a sense of kind of like some kind of like mental
Yeah.
uh, uh, um, acts that allow you to also like unsee and deny someone else's. And if you're able to deny someone who is actually facing very similar realities to you, then of course that person also has the ability to deny you if that person feels that way at a certain point,
Which
right?
which is what has happened. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that I think is a very kind of like sinister type of reality too, and I think Palestinians maybe have to navigate it more, and Kurdish people also have to face. Like I think in this because this country also has very specific demographic realities, so it creates also a very specific type of like political relationship that for instance, there are no almost no Sinhalese people in this country, right? So we don't face similar issues than say like Palestinians or Kurds, and we have a very kind of different ways of also enacting ourselves and also claiming public spaces, when you go on a Kurdish protest through Berlin, it's not necessarily the police that you're fearing, but it's Turkish people, like who are standing, attacking, showing the gray wolf sign and doing all kinds of things. And that's I think is a very specific reality that is embedded in a context, right? And I think for Palestinians similarly, like Germany is a very toxic, hostile landscape in a way that, I mean, a lot of the measures are European measures, right? We see all across Europe. But I think the German social dynamics also kind of like feed into it to create a toxicity that is so specific that it is it needs to be addressed in a very specific way as well.
Yeah. So someone wrote to me, which I think is interesting. So they said, "You're a Palestinian. It's normal for you to center Palestine?" Question mark. And I did want to, so this is it's an interesting critique or question, but for me, I think it's I've always said that Palestine is not a unique situation, and I always say this: it's what's happening to us, like the genocide that's taking place, has taken place elsewhere. But to fully understand how it has taken place elsewhere, and to try to delve yourself into true solidarity, I think, is to first take a step back about your own reality. And I think this is why I opened up the question with, is it really solidarity when you view something when it relates to you? If you're holding up a mirror, is when you see your own humanity, is that when you step in? And that's sort of the whole point of this conversation is to I think to move away from that version of solidarity and to entirely place yourself into the realities of someone else. So that's why I wanted to decenter myself and Palestine for just a second, because again, as I said, Palestine for me is all encompassing. Um,
Yeah, I try to do the same. Like I also try to because oftentimes you see people, like sneakily also like push through their own agenda then, through the back door,
yeah,
uh, when they try to kind of like show solidarity.
yeah,
I
yeah,
find it a bit phony. I'm just like, it's not the moment. I feel like there's also
yeah.
something called common sense where you also think about like when it's more important. And I think there's critical times too, right? Like there's critical times to say certain things, and not all times are the same. Like if something is so immediate, I think it's completely justified to push your attention towards that one thing, And I think like your reality now as a Palestinian, and thinking about what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, I think is very much like where we were 15 years ago, 16 years ago. And in that sense, I'm pretty sure that the majority of Tamil people were also not able to think about anything but
Yeah.
what's happening to them. So I think there's also a biological reality that we
Yeah.
need to also consider and to be maybe fair towards ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, this is too much information. I like broke out in hives today over stress. I couldn't even continue fasting today just of the just the sheer horror that's truly taking place. So I very much resonate with this inability to separate yourself
Mm.
from what's going on. But I want to, so there's a interesting question from the audience here about, so we talk like, this person asked, I wonder whether this conversation would go differently if we looked at the issue of hierarchies and solidarity from a perspective of collective organizing and the relationships between resistance groups and different struggles, which are often exercised outside the public sphere. Based mode of solidarization and are historically much more material. I am wondering, yeah, well, I think it's a good question. What do you think about that?
Mm, not sure if it would look different. I think there's a lot. There were, of course, always very historical kind of relationships, like between different kind of groups, resistance groups, and organizing groups, that were not necessarily, they weren't framed and they weren't in the public for as, like we're today using social media. Um, but I still think in terms of like resources, directionality, and everything, they still had patterns that I would say and would maybe claim to resemble the hierarchies that we have today still, like for instance, like when I think about Bangladeshis, there's always like Bangladeshis, like whenever something happens in Palestine, there's Bangladeshis who will always frame and express the solidarity through Bangladeshi fighters who joined the PLO, who shot down Israeli jets and stuff. And these are all real histories, they're not like some fantasy or something. But I'm, I don't know, I'm always a little bit like, I'm wondering because I don't see it the other way around, right? Like I don't like for instance like when the student revolution happened last year, there were very few like people were not referring it the other way around. And that type of directionality is real, for instance, I can find multiple statements by Tamil groups that were referring to Palestine and the liberation of Palestine, but I probably will have a harder time to find similar statements from Palestinian groups towards Tamlilam,
Yeah.
and that's not to dismiss their politics, and that's not to dismiss the legitimacy of the struggle, but that is also like a very material reality, an historic reality, that where there were certain kind of like dynamics that kind of like continue, and these dynamics should be interrogated without necessarily considering them as attacks towards individual struggles or organizings.
I mean, it does go back to sort of, um, what definitely what's in the periphery, and I could 100% guarantee that a majority of Palestinians have just no idea what's going
Mm,
on. In other parts of the world. I mean, so in that way, I think you're entirely correct, and I find it completely admirable and enlightening to. I mean, I have the sort of what the Tamil Tigers wrote to the Palestinian people, and to be able in the midst of your crucial uh just traumatizing moment to express solidarity with someone else, I feel like just, it takes a lot. Um,
mm,
so there's two fundamental questions that I need to ask, and I need to ask this first about just the sphere of social media, because I mean, for me, social media has been a blessing and such a huge curse. And I've through social media, I met like wonderful people like yourself. I met my husband on Instagram. Like everyone I know basically, if it's not just my childhood friends, it is social media.
mm,
And so yeah, how do you view this day and age of navigating collective organizing work through such a toxic, reductive space?
mm,
Sorry. Yeah.
mm. I mean, I'm not neither a tech pessimist nor optimist. I think I'm trying to be realistic. I feel like, of course, there's lots of disadvantages, but I also think there's a lot of advantages. And I think specifically in regards to displaced, like and stateless people, I feel like our ability to navigate that space, but also our dependency on that space is so different to other groups, like the way of how a lot of us are interconnected like through social media in ways that are maybe some would say not healthy, but that are a response to the fact that we don't share the same analog space, right? So we really are dependent on these kind of like connections. And I think um, navigating them, I think, is difficult, but I feel like there's a lot of criticism of social media anyway. So I like to focus less on that. Like one of the things that I really found interesting about like how Palestinians throughout the genocide were using, for instance, Instagram, was that how people were sharing their accounts, like, and these very kind of like ad hoc ways of responding to censorship, to deplatforming, to internet blackouts, where people were suddenly doing like collective shared posts, or people
Yeah.
like journalists who died handed over or had their passwords and their accounts kind of already shared, and other people would continue with the same kind of like follower accounts and stuff. And these very practical ways of kind of like putting out information, I think are critical. And I think in many ways we can think about how nowadays, for instance, a lot of people, specifically in Palestine, use social media is also counteracting a lot of the traditional media monopoly, and confronting different realities in ways that think is so powerful, and I think these credits need to be given also to people in the ways of how they've weaponized social media back, like to kind of like fit their own realities. Um, Despite the fact that they're still faced with all these criminalizations that happen on social media as well, right?
Yeah. So I just wanted to sort of say that like I guess what I meant to, maybe I didn't phrase it correctly, because for me social media of course has been, the Egyptian revolution, I want something that had a lot of potential, and the spirit of the Arab Spring was to it was called like the WhatsApp revolution. It was
Mm,
through social media, it was through, but my so of course for people sort of cut off from physical spaces of collectivism, which Palestinians are, which the Egyptians were, like of course it was such a fundamental process. But um I'm more talking for us, for
mm,
us here in the West and the diaspora, and
mm.
places where like we have just sort of uh just solely relied on social media
Yeah,
in
yeah.
to um in order to organize or to be a part of collective. And I find like a very huge problem with this. I mean,
Mm.
uh, there's this saying, socialism failed because it took up too many meetings. And I always find that funny because but I feel like it's also true because the true work, the concept of what you're talking about, true solidarity, is when you're physically in the
Mm.
spaces with people. And and social media just doesn't create that
Mm.
like like the space necessary to change and to push the boundaries of what yeah, social change could look like.
I mean, ideally, I think, of course, being in the presence of someone physically is, I think, much more conducive to actually like building relationships that are sustainable, that also are resilient, you know. And I think a lot of times we see it, for instance, when movements like in Palestine or in the Sahrawi camps in Algeria, when solidarity tourism, for instance, is propagated, you know, and people are invited to come to meet the realities, to see them, to witness them, to leave a kind of lasting effect, and also to meet people. And I find these measures, of course, much more fruitful, I think, and also much more sustainable in the long run. But I do think also, like, for instance, like dispersal even within a country, right? Like a lot of for instance, like Germany, through its asylum systems, has dispersed people, you know, like strategically, politically, you know,
Yeah.
and which also forces a lot of people into who, like, there's many centers for many people, but there's not one core center, like in Paris or in France, it would be Paris, or in the UK, it would be London, right? And in that sense, like a lot of the organizing also have is dependent also on these networks, right? That allow to create a template where there's people, where there's more people. For instance, when Palestine Speaks started organizing in Berlin and everything, and then suddenly how that kind of nationalized and everything. All of these things are, of course, always also dependent on social media. But I think ideally, of course, I think it would be much more conducive kind of conversation if we would see each other, because that also did not that kind of makes it more difficult to deny each other's existence and it's each other's kind of feelings and responses towards an issue.
Yeah. I
Honest.
Okay, so I want to talk about nationalism because
Mm.
this is a big question for me. We are always against the concept of just like, severe nationalism, right? Like we're very much nationalism, like in its core, we're like, like taught in our anti-colonialism studies that nationalism is not a good thing. When you're hyper nationalistic, it leads to populism, it leads to dehumanizing people. Um, but but a lot of these liberation struggles are national struggles. And
Mm.
my question is, do you feel that there's a hypocrisy in that? Like there's a contradiction? I mean, I was thinking about this on my way to pick up my son today. I'm like, does when they say Palestine is a national struggle, but I mean the fundamental thing is for Palestinians, they want to return home. For me,
Mm.
I don't care if there's something called a state or whatever, if there's borders. I just want to be in my home and not be bothered, you know?
Mm.
And my question to you is, but when Kurdish people want a state and different ethnic groups want a state and all, and my I guess I don't know. Is it? I've always had this contradiction between nationalist struggles because if everyone just wants a state, then it doesn't
Mm.
feel like it doesn't feel like a revolutionary liberation struggle. It just
Mm.
feels like we're state building. And do you what do you think about that? For me, it's always been a contradiction. I never knew how to approach it.
I mean, I think it's like a trap of colonial modernity, right? The fact that our response to an issue is to replicate the issue and to kind of like find a solution within that system. And I feel like colonial modernity kind of also disallows us from finding different solutions to something like community, to something like a collective, and to land relationships, right? And I think in many ways, our resistance movements are oftentimes also responses of these kind of like modern ways of nation building, you know, and then anti-colonial movements adopting kind of nationalist kind of frameworks and nationalist kind of rhetoric and ideologies. I wouldn't say all nationalisms are the same, of course. I think there's nationalisms that are oppressive, and then there's nationalism that are liberatory. But a lot of the liberatory nationalism, of course, at some point they also will, like entail certain kind of oppressive structures from within,
Right.
as we can see in the case of Eritrea, for instance. So I think ideally we should move away from this.
No.
But I feel like there's a material reality where a lot of us also understand that the only escape from a state's violence is to form your own state, right? And of course, that is a contradiction. But in many ways, other ways of existence are not respected either. When we think about Rojava, for instance, as a way of building something that is outside of, like um, statehood, that organizes itself through cantons, through self-organized kind of like groupings, who come together, have a lot of meetings, as you were saying, and have this kind of like tedious process of building a collective structure. As much as they're imagining and trying to kind of establish a different reality that contradicts statehood, that very lack of statehood makes them also vulnerable in a very nation state centered world towards the violence of other nation states that will then attack it. Like, for instance, how the new Syrian government, was kind of like forcing them into an agreement, or Turkey invading them, and occupying them, and these kinds of vulnerability force us oftentimes into this like into a trap, but also into what do you call it? Like into a corner, in which we lack a response. Like, for instance, I also am someone who supports Tamil independence, and but I always argue my sense of independence is an argument towards a protection from genocide, and that is the only kind of like envisionment or reason for statehood that I would, like seek and envision, and even in, like, for instance, we had in 77, we had a resolution called Vattukode resolution, which was a resolution that was formulating our statehood and giving the state a set of principle, constitutional kind of like directions. And some of them, they were all socialist, but some of them were also very specific in terms of like rights towards other groups, like rights towards like so-called minorities and stuff, and these kinds of envisionments maybe are idealistic and oftentimes crumble once we actually build these states. But I also feel like there are very few alternatives.
Yeah.
Um,
So nationalism for you is when when it's sort of bred out of this like resisting annihilation. So
yes,
that's different.
to me that's different, but it's only different in a certain specific time and modus, right? Like once you have actually achieved that kind of like protection, um, and
The
then I
struggle
think
is different then.
yeah, and I think then is actually the moment to combat that nationalism. I feel like what we build is also what we kind of like charities. Like charities should ideally only exist to kind of like alleviate an issue, and the moment that issue is kind of like responded to, that charity just should dissolve. And in
Yeah.
the same way, that nationalism should also dissolve in different kind of ways once the immediate issue, is resolved.
Wow. Well, thank you. There are questions in the chat, but unfortunately, I don't have more time to devote to this amazing conversation. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Sinthujan, for such an enlightening talk. And I hope through this conversation, people have understood solidarity a little bit different, or maybe we just confused 100 people even.
Maybe,
But
yeah.
even if I hope you're engaging with the different questions that we brought up, and definitely buy Sinthujan's book. I will post a link to my story after the after this event, so you could check it out there. And if you can also follow zaytuna.rnk, only because we really try to engage and create these spaces online and in person. So, please, I'll write it in the chat. So yeah, definitely follow us there. Um, and
Thank you so much, Heber, for organizing and also conducting this conversation today, and I know it's a very difficult day, and yeah, all my solidarity and love to you.
thank you so much. And again, like, this is a moment of time to also just go out on the streets and, really have material to your solidarity, and I will do the same, and hopefully we could have some sort of healing when we're in a physical space together. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so
Uh,
much.
for those of you who are fasting, have a lovely iftar in a little bit, and we'll hopefully see you guys next time. Bye bye.
Bye.